Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bridges of Belonging. This is conversation number 18, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with our two incredible guests today. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Andrea Carey. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm really grateful to be on Coast Salish territory here in Victoria. Home of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, where I've just felt so safe and welcomed, particularly during COVID. So I'm very grateful that they've taken such incredible stewardship of the lands over generations. So we're going to kick off. I do have a reading to get us started today. And those of you that have joined us before know that I love my different quotes. So I'm going to read from Becoming from Michelle Obama today. And I have shared this reading once before, but it just seemed really timely to share it again today. I'm an ordinary person who found herself on an extraordinary journey. In sharing my story, I hope to create space for other stories and other voices, to widen the pathway for who belongs and why. I've been lucky enough to get to walk into stone castles, urban classrooms, and Iowa kitchens, just trying to be myself, just trying to connect. For every door that's open to me, I've tried to open my door to others. And here's what I have to say. Finally, let's invite one another in. Maybe then we can begin to fear less, to make fewer wrong assumptions, to let go of our biases and stereotypes that unnecessarily divide us. Maybe we can better embrace the ways we are the same. It's not about being perfect. It's not about where you get yourself in the end. There's power in allowing yourself to be known and heard, in owning your unique story, in using your authentic voice. And there's grace in being willing to know and to hear others. This, for me, is how we become. And that just seemed like such a perfect reading for the two guests that we have today, because both of you are sharing your own story in such beautiful ways and elevating the voices of others to share their story and journey, and for us all to find places where we can belong together. So I'm going to introduce Ainka first. Ainka Jess is passionate about communications and empowering women. She combined her love of sport and over 10 years of communications and media relations experience to launch She's for Sports in 2016. The network brings women together to have a larger voice in sports through digital content and events. And I didn't even know about She's for Sports until the pandemic. And so one of the gifts of the pandemic is how it connects us and introduces us to people we wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to meet. So we'll hear from Ainka in just a second. Gail Hamamoto is the executive director of BC Wheelchair Sports Association, and she's the vice president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee and has been with the board of directors since 2009. She's an incredible voice for equity in sport, a passionate advocate for sport development throughout the system, and has organized multiple international wheelchair rugby events, as well as many other parasport events at the national, provincial, and local level. And someone that I have relied on as a mentor for many years now. So grateful to have both of you here with me today and to share with our audience your journeys of belonging. So I'm going to turn it over to you to share a little bit more about your story and your journey, and how She's for Sports all came about and how that connects for you.
Yeah, I look back and, you say 2016, and we all can't believe how fast time is going. And especially this year, you're like, what month is it? What month are we in? But really, my story takes place with starting with conversations. So I had a lot of conversations with colleagues, friends, and women in sport in 2016. And I just noticed there was a common theme. There was a really low sentiment in terms of their engagement with sport. Them telling me they didn't see people that looked like them being represented in sports media coverage. Colleagues telling me they were looking for their young daughters to play in a baseball team, but there wasn't any team for girls. There were just teams for boys. So just a lot of those stories of them being sports fans and not seeing themselves being, represented, included in fan engagement. And the sentiment was just really low. And I just said to myself, what can I do about that? Because the conversations, you have conversations with people, but when you go home, you still have those conversations percolating in your mind. And I knew throughout my career that I wanted to do something that would empower and support women. At the time, I didn't know it would be women in sport, but it all just made sense. You know, I had built up my corporate comms career, and I was working in media as well. So just hearing all those narratives, booking guests for interviews and stuff. So I had those skill sets. And then I also just said, you know, well, I'm a huge Toronto sports fan. I never felt like I was silenced. I would tweet at the Raptors games. I would you know, go to hockey games with friends who just said, you know, we have an extra ticket. Do you want to go? Because sports brings people together. So I never felt that I didn't have a voice, because I would just do, you know, I would just engage the way that I wanted to engage. But that didn't necessarily mean that that was other people's experiences. So I just saw that there was a gap. You know, there wasn't any platform that specifically created a safe space for women to talk about sports. And also the other layer was LGBTQ plus, diverse communities who may not identify themselves as women, but also felt that there were some barriers with engaging and accessing sport. So I just said, how can I put my arms around all these people and create some sort of platform that will allow them to feel like they're being seen, feel like they have a voice, and also address some of the advocacy pieces with sport. You know, we know girls drop out of sport once they hit puberty. We know that when it comes to varsity resources in sport, on the varsity side, they tend to, you know, fund and invest in men's sport, but not always women. We know there's a pay equity issue. So I just felt like building this platform, we could address some of those things and try to move the dial on inclusion in sport. So I've been doing that for about 4.5 years, and it's been quite exciting. You noted our digital series that we did during the pandemic. So we've still continued to tell those stories and feature these awesome people in sport. Originally, we are definitely a digital and content-based platform, but we also did on-site events. Because of COVID, we had to pivot to online events. But we've kept the ball moving, and it's been quite interesting to feature these different people in sport who have something to say and definitely should have their voices heard.
No, it's amazing. As I said, like it sort of felt like you came out of nowhere. And then when I did some digging, I'm like, oh my gosh, no, not at all. But I think the pandemic allowed you to elevate your voices to a totally different level. So kind of
Yes.
a gift for you. How has that explosion kind of been?
There are days when it's overwhelming. You know, an overwhelming piece was I was lying in bed one morning. It was like 5 in the morning, and I was just kind of looking through Twitter and didn't realize that the New York Times had written about our panel. Like I just didn't realize it. Like you know, I just didn't. No one sent me the article, which is fine. That's why there's the power of digital and social and that wide reach. But I wasn't expecting that. And they talked about our panel, talked about some of the issues we were raising when it came to anti-Black racism, social injustice in sport, and that tipping point and tipping moment that we're all in as a society trying to address that. And I just didn't know that Choose Your Words would have been featured in that article. They also hyperlinked our website, and we are Toronto-based, definitely grassroots startup. So it was great to get the support of the New York Times in that feature, because they're a global paper or publication. So, you know, we want to be able to reach more people to let them know some of the things that we're doing, and what a way to do it, you know. So it is overwhelming sometimes when you get that, because you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, you know, and just trying to figure out what's next, and, you know, what other organizations we can align ourselves with who are pushing for equity in sport, who are trying to address some of the issues with racial injustice in sport. And you know, we featured a panel with different people talking about mental health in sport. So we just kind of really want to make sure we're looking at some of those issues and including different voices. We had a woman who is very, she made my mind my mind was blown after hearing her speak about some of the Indigenous communities and how they address mental health in their communities. You know, we're always learning, and I hope we're able to give people also tuning into some of our content a learning moment. These are quite critical times where we all have to listen and learn, but try to understand. And I think that panel of having those mental health experts and having this woman speak about a different community, I was like taking notes, you know, and I was the moderator. So yeah, it's quite overwhelming some days. Sometimes, as I said, you carry these conversations with you when you turn off your computer. Some of these conversations are very heavy, but I feel like, you know, the more we keep on pushing this boulder up the hill of trying to get to that equity piece and inclusion piece, you know, I feel like I'm doing my little part from Toronto. So
Awesome. Thank you. Gail, I'm going to flip it over to you. Tell us a little bit more about your journey and sort of how you got into the sport roles you've been in and how that's played out in terms of what you think and feel about belonging.
I'd like to say my journey was planned, but it absolutely was not planned. And for someone who lives her life by a plan, it's it's revolutionary. Um, I grew up in sport. I was a rhythmic gymnast. I coached for 20 years. I was on the board of directors of the organization. I also grew up playing softball and volleyball, and sport was a big part of my life. And but when I went to school, I didn't think of sport as a career. I don't think it was as prevalent in terms of the kinds of education you could get to be a sport administrator, that kind of thing. It just wasn't on my radar. But when I graduated, I happened to work for the local sport organization. Wasn't feeling it, wasn't the kind of culture and environment that really spoke to me. Went back to design school, and at the same time applied for a part-time job with BC Wheelchair Sports. There was a maternity leave that had happened, and they needed someone to come back and share the position. And I didn't know anything about wheelchair sport. I didn't even know it existed. And so I literally called the national office and I said, tell me what this is. And they described the different wheelchair sports that were out there. They described Kathy Newman, who has gone on to, be one of the most important people in my life. And they said, these are the things that are important to Kathy. These are the things that you should talk about in your interview. And took the interview and lo and behold, got the job. And it's funny because when I asked her afterwards, why, what was important to you in the interview, it was the coaching aspect, that I had coached for 20 years. And that was something that I had totally downplayed in my interview. I was going for an administrative position. So I don't think you ever really know what people are looking for or what's important to them in that process. And so we recently did some interviews here and we did some debriefs, and I encouraged the applicants to share those parts of their experiences and their lives that are important, and that they might not think are directly related to the position, but that make them more of a whole person. And so I committed to that job for 2 years and said, after the 2 years, I'm out. I'm doing full-time design work, and Kathy said, no problem. We'd love to have you for those 2 years. When it came time to leave the organization, I said, okay, I'm starting school in September. I paid my tuition. I bought all my books. I worked really hard for that spot in that program. They took 16 people that year. We all had to compete really hard for that spot. And Kathy, in her very wise way, didn't post the job. She didn't hire anybody. She made me an offer. She took me to lunch and she said, what do you think this organization needs to do to move forward? And I told her, I said, you need to create positions where people can stay with you long term. Parasport, especially at that time, it was a sharp learning curve for anybody coming into the organization. And really by the time you understood what it was all about, was a 2-year process, and then you could make an impact, and then you could make change, and then you could really move things forward. And so being Kathy, she said, so well, if I offered you this with this and this and this, would you stay? I went home and I agonized and I talked to my parents, and I came back and said, no, I have a plan. This is my plan. This is what I'm doing. And the whole summer passed, and literally the day before school was to start, so I've paid my several thousands of dollars in tuition and what have you. I walked into my advisor's office in tears and said, I'm not coming. And I went back to wheelchair sports. And I did it because it spoke to my values. It spoke to what I cared about. There were people there that, I thought to myself, who do I want to surround myself with? And the quality of the people, that spoke to me. It was like, these are the people that I want to spend my life with. This is the impact that I want to have. And when I look back, when I've retired, what do I want to say I did? And I want to say that I had an impact, and I want to say that I changed lives. And so just starting at Wheelchair Sport as a program coordinator, a part-time program coordinator, that gave me that feeling and gave me that passion that I never knew that I would have. I didn't know what parasport was. I had no idea until I had that opportunity. So totally serendipitous blessing in my life, and one that I don't regret for a second. That decision was made 26 years ago. Um, so, so a long time. Clearly that was a really good decision to make, and everything has built upon that. And lifelong friends have come from it. Dear, dear people that I love, and amazing experiences for not just me, but for my son. And it's just can't ask for anything more.
Yeah, I mean, what a journey it's been for you. I loved the part where you talked about how the culture and environment in sport wasn't what you wanted, but then you found your place within wheelchair sport and the alignment with values and the quality of the people. So I'm going to stay on that track, and I want you to just elaborate a little bit on sort of like, what are your values and how are those showing up for you and what you've continued to do there?
That's a great question, and it's also one that we added to our interviews recently. And it's funny because a values-based leadership right now is, and I shouldn't say right now, but that it's named right now, is everything to me. And I think it's really the only thing that makes difficult decisions clear. When I think about the decision that we had to make as the Canadian Paralympic Committee Board of Directors to not send a team to Tokyo for the Paralympic Games ahead of those games being postponed, how do you make a decision like that that has incredible impact? Impact first and foremost on the athletes who we are here to serve. And then secondarily, financial impact, human resource impact, just reputational impact. It's enormous. And how do you make those decisions? Well, you have to make them based on your values, and we looked at, athlete-centered, athlete-first decision making. We looked at the whole person. These aren't just athletes, these are whole people, and their health and safety, both from a physical perspective and from a mental health perspective, has to be foremost always. Second, not secondarily, but in addition to that, the safety of our coaches, the safety of all of the people that support the system. And so when you look at values-based leadership, for me, it's been the only thing that's the only clear voice inside of me, because I tend to overanalyze everything. Like I want all the data, I want all the information, and then I want a month to think about it. So that doesn't always work. We made that decision very, very quickly. And it was solely a values-based, what is the most important thing? So me, people first, integrity, honesty. Like honesty for me is number one. Empathy. So I think a lot of what we're talking about in belonging is empathy and compassion. And people first for me means that. So how do you show up for other people, but also how do you receive what other people are sending out into the universe, and thinking about why are they sending that out? Why, before you judge, before you act, before you respond, try to think about it from their perspective, and perhaps what's coming up for them. And so, those are only some of the values, but certainly some of the most important ones.
Amazing. Great answer. I love it. I'm going to flip back to you. In the platform you've created and the voices you're bringing to the conversation, you said at the beginning you really started that to kind of elevate how women and girls have opportunities and show up in the sports space. So how do values connect for you in all of that, and how are you supporting those voices for them to show up in the ways they need?
That is a very good question, because the feedback I get sometimes on our website or at our events is, how did you get these voices and these women? Like, they are women who are leading authentic lives, and people who are, they'll say, they're just like me. I dealt with that thing as a mom in sport, or I dealt with that. And that's always sort of the model, I guess, or the guiding light that I'm trying to follow. Like, who are these people who are living authentic lives, who had trials, who've had challenges, who persevered, who are going through building resilience like all of us are. So that kind of human approach for me, and you talked about athletes first, human-based approach. You know, I've had to say no to some people that have reached out to me who wanted to collaborate, because when they told me what their goals were or values were for working together, it was either something about increasing sales, or it just wasn't focused on the right reasons. And I definitely can feel that in my gut when I'm talking to someone. And it's hard to say no or decline. But every time I either put an event together or I'm looking for speakers, it has to be the right voices. And there are some people that you might try to connect with that will say, you know, I'm going through a hard time right now. Can we connect maybe next year when I'm, you know, kind of done dealing with some things? And I feel like when I'm communicating with people who, you know, on the pre-call, and they feel very comfortable with just sharing, you know, I don't, you know, just creating that safe space for people even before they're on our panels, you know, calling them, asking how they're doing. Is this a good time? You know, we can all be very excited to participate sometimes, but if you're going through some personal things, it might be hard to share. So I've always, you know, had that environment, even on the phone virtually, where people feel very comfortable telling me their stories and saying, you know, exactly how they feel. And that's the environment we want to create, whether it's virtual or on site at our events, where people can just be themselves. I had one mother who, her daughter was in the audience and her daughter was 6 and she wanted to like hug her mom who was on stage. So I said, you know, come right up. And she sat on her mom's lap for the rest of the panel. We just kind of want to have that environment. You know, we're all going through this thing called life. We're all trying to do the best we can. It's not about having a perfect event where everyone just sits there and doesn't feel like the comfort level to share and to be their authentic self and bring their whole self to the panel. As I said, I've let people bring their kids up on stage, or you know, somebody who might divert to another story of something personal that they dealt with, and they ask, can I share that? And we want that environment to be realistic. We want people to feel safe to bring their whole self. There really isn't, you know, we're not going to scream or get angry at anybody if they said something, you know, about their personal life that they're willing to share. So I think Shisha Sports has been successful because people have shared with us that they've been to other events and they're kind of that perfect event, you know, and they don't feel like they can just kind of be human or network after. Like after our events, our on-site events, we actually have the panelists who feel comfortable networking with these women and diverse people in the room, because you never know, that could help them, you know, grow up the pipeline of hiring more women in sport, or it could just be somebody who's looking for a role model. So people will feel very comfortable at our events, and even virtually when we have, you know, if you'd like to add something to the chat or a Q&A, but it's just bringing your whole self, having that human kind of centric focus, where it's about the human, it's about the person. And that's sort of how I've built the organization and sort of built our platform.
No, that's awesome. And I can certainly attest to our first conversation when you asked me a series of questions and sort of checked in on like what were my driving forces behind this speaker series before you agreed to do it. So I love that you're like walking and talking those values, and that you use them as a screening process in terms of what you connect to. It's such an important part to be able to live your authentic life. And especially at a time when your reputation's kind of skyrocketing, right? It is flattering to get the requests, but making sure those align with what you want and where you want to contribute and who you want to work with. So,
and one more thing, sometimes people email me and say, well, I'm coming on your panel, what should I wear? I always get that. And I said, wear what you feel comfortable wearing. You know, if you're normally in your pajamas or jeans, or you're in a full suit, and they've always liked that, because they said, well, you know, they did a panel thing last week and they had to, you know, it was business attire. And I just said, just come to the event in your comfortable wear, because then you won't fully bring your whole self. You won't be yourself. You know, you might just kind of feel a little uncomfortable, and I don't want anybody feeling uncomfortable. So I always find that a very interesting one, that people always say, I've seen, like they'll say, I've Googled you and I've seen you, but what should I wear? You know, and you're like, just be yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Gail, I'm going to flip back to you. Why don't you tell us about a time you didn't belong?
Oof, you know, I was reflecting on that question a little bit, and early in my sport career, I was often the youngest at the table. I was often the only woman, and I was often the only person advocating for people with disabilities in sport. And that can be very, very isolating. I also felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders because I was the only, and that if I didn't speak up or advocate strongly enough, then I'd be letting people down that I was there to serve, that, you know, that I cared really deeply about. And as an introvert in an extrovert's world, this was especially hard, you know. And then some people think you're an introvert. You know, I really am an introvert. Like everybody should know I probably turned Andrea down a couple times before I said I would do this, because I'm quite happy in my little cave by myself. Throughout that journey, there were lots of times when I didn't really feel that I belonged or could bring my full person to the table. And then very suddenly, I found myself to be a single parent of a 2-year-old. And the world became very small and very scary. So I'm really glad, Ainka, that you raised motherhood, because it's a huge part of the journey, I think, for many of us. You know, I couldn't even see how I could belong within the context of my own life, with my own family and friends, never mind belonging at a board table or at a Paralympic Games, or, you know, on a committee. You know, how do I have the confidence to do that, or to lead? And I honestly felt that I was alone in my pain and my fear. But very quickly, people reached out, and held out their hands and lifted me up and carried me, literally carried me. And it was really up to me to, sorry, I'm going to get emotional. I do that too. But it was really up to me to trust them, and then also to learn to trust myself through that. So for me, it's funny, because when we think about this question of belonging and not belonging, they're so linked. For me, I've been so blessed that those moments of not feeling like I belonged were always almost immediately connected with someone helping me to belong. And so I'm grateful for that. Yeah, and it's a journey. It's a journey every day, in whatever role you take, in whatever situation you find yourself in. Yeah, that's it. It's a lifelong, I think, task, but also opportunity and gift that I've been very lucky to receive from other people, and hope to give it back to others.
What a beautiful response. Thank you. And thank you for your vulnerability in sharing that, Gail. And I'm grateful that you've had so many people in your life that have connected and supported and allowed your beautiful colors to shine through in every opportunity. Ainka, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you the same question about a time you didn't belong.
Yeah, I look back, and and one example really kind of screams at me, and it's I was working in communications, and unfortunately, I had a supervisor who just wasn't appropriate. She would make really inappropriate comments during our stand-up meetings, and just very, you know, talking about people that she didn't like in her own personal life and what she would do to them. And it didn't make sense, because we were there to talk about, you know, our communications plan and strategy. So I'm not sure if she was kind of going through her own stuff, but it just wasn't appropriate. And then she made a reference to the KKK. And at that time, working where I've worked, I've never had an issue with racist comments or anybody you know, making employees feel unsafe to be in that environment. And it was very disappointing. I can say, though, that it wasn't like she had made inappropriate comments the first week or so that I was there. It was kind of a lead up, and I just kept on seeing a pattern of, it was just very dysfunctional. So I had to speak to HR, and it was a very scary choice to make. I felt alone. You know, if I look at that team, I was the only person of color on that team. And I was also, you know, new to the team. But this was going on for a while. And, you know, based on hearing from some of the other colleagues, they just kind of said, this is, you know, this woman's one that nobody likes to work with, and kind of brushed it off and left it there. But I just said, you know what, I went home the day that I figured I was going to make that decision. And I said, you know, my impetus for going to HR was that I didn't want anybody else who was working at that organization to have to deal with that with her. I just kind of said in my head, it has to stop somewhere. But I was very uncomfortable going to HR. You know, sometimes you have this fear of rocking the boat, or you just have this fear of, well, what's the outcome going to be? You know, is that going to impact me? Is that going to impact my work? But what the driving force was for me was I don't want anybody else to have to feel like they don't belong or feel like there is, you know, trauma with her words and not feeling, you know, having, you know, you talk about psychological safety. Just, I didn't want anyone else to feel what I felt. So luckily, HR did take the process that they had to take. You know, things were resolved. They didn't put me back in the environment to have to work with her, and I guess they might have let her go or moved her on to another department. But I think when you can look outside of yourself. You know, you could have all the anger and the frustration and the fear, but when you can look outside of yourself and say, you know what, I don't want this to happen to another human, so I have to be the one to try to change this. That is an area that gave me strength. So if I look back now out of it, was not a very pleasant experience at all, something I was not expecting, because I've had pretty much gone through, like, I'm not saying I'm gone through the end of my career, but it wasn't like I was in a level entry job. Like, you know, I was kind of in communications for a while. I've never encountered anyone like that before. It's a little disappointing that people like that exist, but sometimes as a victim, you have power in your victimhood. You have power and you don't always see it. But the power for me was saying, you know what, I don't want this to happen to somebody else. And you talk about empathy, you talk about people coming after you. Sometimes it's not for you because you've gone through something and you've had that negative experience and you can't erase the past, but it's for somebody else that might be coming up after you, that you're helping.
Absolutely. And, you know, then you fast forward to where you're at today and the work you're doing and how you're facilitating those conversations to kind of counteract what's happening in society that we're not having the conversations we need to have about yet. So tell me a little bit about sort of belonging and when that's showing up for you and what that looks and feels like.
You know, when I look back at belonging and I try to align Choose for Sports with that term, I always said to myself, I wanted to create a space where women and diverse people were empowered. And that empowerment also comes with feeling seen. You know, we've heard a lot of people say, you know, through this year, especially, you know, when we were seeing the injustices in July with George Floyd being killed by the police and, you know, anti-Black racism and all of those movements and just trauma and stress that everybody has been going through watching some of these visuals. You start to ask yourself, well, who are the voices we're not hearing from? Who are the voices that are continually being stifled and oppressed, and what can I do to change that? And what can I do to make sure an athlete who is suffering from anxiety is seen, an athlete who is Indigenous and you know, was a part of some of the Indigenous movements growing up. How can I make sure she's seen? I've featured a woman who was transgender on a hockey team. How can I make her seen? And also in our series, we've highlighted a Paralympic athlete who had spina bifida, and my brother-in-law has spina bifida. So you just start thinking about the people who aren't seen, who don't feel like they have a place, they don't feel like they belong, and what can you do to help them with that, help them to be seen, help them to have their voices heard. Again, I think I noted that in the beginning of one of my questions, that we're at a tipping point now where we cannot you know, put out a statement or a press release to say, as an organization, we're inclusive and we see people, when you're not putting the action piece there. I think we're at a point now where most consumers and people are looking and the public's watching and they want to see that you are putting action to that. So if there are people that don't belong and you've shut them out for years and centuries, like, what are you doing today to make sure they're included? What are you doing today to deal with representation, to deal with your board or your office and making sure that there are diverse voices and experiences highlighted and included? I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think we can do it. You know, we just have to be authentic about it and want to actually put that action forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the performative statements and actions in social media aren't cutting it anymore. And I think that's been a really hard shift for those who have been able to get away with that for so long to kind of make, but that reckoning like hit an absolute pinnacle this year. And it's like, there's no going back. So how are we going to go forward? And how can you be so intentional about creating a different way forward for each person to show up however they need, and to make sure that we reach back and support those that haven't had the opportunity. So thank you for the work you're doing in that space to elevate those voices.
I also was going to say one thing too, the people that aren't feeling like there aren't spaces where they belong, they are also becoming more amplified. Their voices are louder, and rightfully so. So it's just an interesting time, those who sometimes hear from athletes who are queer, or somebody who might email me an article about body positivity and not feeling like they belong in the athleisure sports space. So there's a lot of voices, and rightfully so, they should be louder, and hopefully companies can start to listen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I've been working in this space for many years now, and it's just like, it's fascinating to me when we sort of have these tipping points, and that it's like, instead of having to have the conversation about why we're doing this work, it's like all of a sudden people are like, okay, what do we do? And, it's such a rich opportunity, but then you also want to make sure that they do things in a way that is true to their values, or the values that are stated, so that it becomes authentic as they go forward and sustainable. Gail, over to you to talk about, you referenced sort of sport and your place in sport as being some opportunities for belonging, but tell us a little bit more about sort of where and how you belong.
Well, kind of back to my reference in terms of when I felt I didn't belong, and what brought me, well, continues to bring me into a space of belonging. And really, it's been a lot of mentorship, female mentorship, sponsorship, and friendship along the way. And so I have such gratitude for the people that reached out. People like Kathy that I already referenced. She created a work environment that let me put my family first, and she supported new opportunities, and she supported my mental health, and she showed me how to lead through her example. People like Kathy Cadieux, who's the CEO of Wheelchair Rugby Canada, she literally used her own air miles so that I could bring my son with me to international competitions and international board meetings, because I said to her right away, when the world blew up, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't serve on this board anymore. I have to be home with Noah. And she said, nope. She said, here's a ticket, you're bringing him, we will figure it out. And, and we did. And the community rallied, and we figured it out. Carla Qualtrough, who was then the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, who said, you should run for the board. And one of the things about me that I'm working on is that often it takes someone to say to me, you could do this, before I believe it myself or will put myself forward. So I had to run for that board and compete for that position. But it was Carla's voice that said, you belong here, you could do this. Debbie Lowe of the Canadian Sport Institute Ontario, she keeps dropping these little nuggets. You should do this thing, or you should do that thing. And now she's gotten to the point where she's literally yelling stuff across the lobby of national congresses. Hey, Gail. I'm like, whoa, Debbie, be quiet. The introverted me is like, wanting to just kind of duck out of that. But people that remind me that I belong, remind me that my voice belongs at the table, and that I can do these things, because often the self-doubt or the comfort-seeking part of me may not take those steps, and I'm forever appreciative of people like Laurel Crosby, who's been our president here, and the steadfast sage advice. Karen O'Neill, oh my gosh, we are so blessed to be able to work with Karen, who lives this values-based leadership, literally 24 hours a day. And just this circle of people. So in wheelchair sport, the reason I stayed was this belonging, and that's something that Kathy created, and that's something that I try really hard to continue. So I cannot say enough about the people that I'm privileged to work with every day in my organization. All our staff, our coaches, our athletes, we work really hard to try to create a community of belonging. And I'm grateful for them. They show up for each other. They show up for me. I honestly feel we have an organization where everybody has each other's back, and that sense of belonging, I think, is often what keeps people there longer than maybe normal people would stay. And that we always think about, people go off and they have team building weekends and that kind of thing. Well, we do event hosting. And we do it at and Andrew's laughing because I usually drag her into the events that we host. So we've hosted everything from local events all the way up to the World Championships for wheelchair rugby. And there is nothing that brings a team together faster than hosting an event and having to live in each other's pockets for 17 hours a day and scraping out some sleep and literally carrying food to each other and saying, eat this now. And that sense of belonging that we create in our team through sort of trial by fire, really. I mean, it's the same thing you get if you're mission staff on a team to a Paralympic Games. You go through the fire together, and sport provides you that environment. And then if done right, you come out the other end and you still love each other and you still support each other rather than like destroying one another, which thankfully we've never done. So, and then extending to how that comes out in the programs at Wheelchair Sport. So we created the Bridging the Gap program, and the whole purpose of the Bridging the Gap program was to identify all of the barriers to participation in sport for a person with a disability. So Kathy Newman, Sean Blythe, and I literally sat in a room for the better part of 3 days and whiteboarded all of the barriers to participation for someone with a disability, whether they were their own self-confidence, whether it was equipment, whether it was lack of appropriate quality programming, whether it was transportation, whatever it might be. And then we endeavored to create a program that could address those barriers and sought to remove them. Peer support was an enormous part of it. And we tried to create that belonging for each individual person. So one of the tenets of Bridging the Gap is that we provide service to that individual based on what that individual needs. And it's unlike other sport organizations where, I get to sign my son up for hockey and he goes, well, and we hope it's a safe, welcoming, inclusive environment. But in wheelchair sport and in a lot of adaptive sport, we find the individual, we find out what their barriers to participation are, we wrap support around them as best that we can. We have to listen and learn about that individual. And what we've learned most recently is that even though it's very specialized, it's still a somewhat generic approach, wasn't sufficient in terms of servicing individuals who were from Indigenous communities, and that we didn't know how to do that. We didn't have enough cultural understanding. We didn't have the relationships. We still don't know. We're still learning. We're still listening. We're still trying to build those pieces. And so we started a number of years ago to develop an Indigenous Bridging the Gap program. And it's still very in an evolving state. We still have a ton to learn. But the beginning point of that is that we need to acknowledge and recognize that there are cultural differences, that there is intersectionality, and how do we do better so that everyone can belong.
Oh my gosh, as you were describing that, and even though I certainly know of Bridging the Gap, it just struck me, we were in some conversations last week at the national sports system level where, we continue to wrestle with how we actually build a system for people and sports that serve people. And it's like, wow, how could we take Bridging the Gap as a model to actually build out what people need rather than what the systems have imposed upon us in sport for generations that really isn't working.
Yeah, and that's an example of where we've gone. I mean, my staff also created Go Time in partnership with BC Wheelchair Basketball that focuses on girls and women with disability in sport. And I think, for much of the beginning of my career, my mindset was, well, we serve people with disabilities, like that they're already underserved. That's enough, for lack of a better word. And then my own learning and my own understanding and my own curiosity was like, oh, wait a minute, that's not enough. That's not nearly enough. Everyone shows up as their whole self. Yes, there might be a person who has a disability, but they are a woman. They are a person from an Indigenous community. They are a newcomer to Canada. They're from LGBTQ. I'm going to say it the wrong way. Various communities, right? And until we understand and appreciate and get curious about all of those other things that people are, then we're not doing the best that we can to create belonging and to ensure that everyone has a place in sport. And for us, a place in sport doesn't just mean, yay, I get to play wheelchair rugby. It means belonging in the most important sense of the word. The peer support, the peer learning for someone who might have had a traumatic injury that they gain through their participation in sport is unparalleled. There's nothing that can replace it. And the gift is that our athletes understand that, and the willingness that they have to give back to other people that are starting out is incredible. And that's where the magic is.
Yeah. Wow. I also really appreciate the comment that you sign your child up and you just hope it's a good experience.
We're working on that.
Wow.
We are working on that. But yeah, it's shocking some of the things that you see as a sport administrator as you put your child into the sport system, and then
Totally.
try hard not to take over your child's sport experience, because that's not necessarily a good thing. But yeah, that's got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I was going to say, sport is going through a reckoning right now itself. I mean, it's, was bred in this foundation of being, obviously the focus more on men's and boys sport. And also who's in the boardrooms of some of these front offices in these large sport organizations. We tend to see old white male or just male. And now, sports really trying to figure out that inclusion piece, that, why haven't we had other voices and other ideas to innovate sport? We're seeing this digital transformational shift. We're seeing startups coming up with their own, sport innovation ideas, and people who are, hiring women. You talked about intersectionality, women over 50, somebody who's queer, you're starting to see some people really walking the walking, talking the talk. But I think sometimes sport kind of shoots itself in the foot, where a lot of people are used to a specific foundation and a specific way that things are supposed to go. And a lot of that, when I talk to some of the leaders in sport, they say it's tied to financial gain and predictions of, if we set things up in this way, there's definitely a revenue and financial tie to that. But now we're seeing, as I said, consumers really demanding that we have different people at the table, where we have our values aligned to addressing things like social injustice. And they're not going to stand for it anymore. There's so much data out there about women that engage in sport around the world. But then we see statistics like less than 4% or 4% of sport coverage only features women. It doesn't make sense that we are consumers of sport. We participate in sport, whether we're Paralympics or we're doing other things in sport. As I said, in the front office, women have been leading and driving and been a part of sport for a very long time. And it's really sad that we aren't treated as consumers. Our voices aren't always included. I spoke to a gentleman the other day, and he works sort of on the corporate side, and he was just saying, oh, it's going to be such a big risk to grow women's sport. And after I was done talking to him, I felt more like his perception of growing women's sport and getting to a place of inclusion was more of a burden. Women's sport should not be a burden. We are human just like men, and we engage in sport, we play sport, we consume it. So it should be the same thing. If you're investing in men's sport, invest in women's sport. And it's a bit of a shame to hear grown men talking about, oh, this big risk and it's a burden and how are we going to do this, when, from my own condo and a very small team, I'm in Toronto and I'm trying to move the needle on inclusion in sport. We can do it. We have to just get over ourselves, I guess, for a lack of, other words, get over ourselves, get over how we think the old model was, and transform and move forward to a new model. That's the only way.
Yeah, and I think probably, I won't speak for Gail, but I couldn't agree more. And, we continue to sort of be in conversations, and I'll reference the one we were in last week where, several people want to disrupt the system. They realize it's not working. They want change. My prediction is if we allow those people, though, to drive it, they will bring the same people back to the table, because that's all they've known. And so how do you do it differently so that you end up with a different outcome than what we've got? And, that's sort of the risk, right? It's like people are diving into things that they don't know anything about. It feels scary and, you know, the unknowns, but it's our opportunity right now. And I can't imagine a better time in our history to take this opportunity.
Yeah, I had someone that I featured on our panel, and she said, people have to get out of the way and bring the right people in, as you said, to do the work. It doesn't matter if you know, they're not in your friend circle or your network circle, because we tend to have biases and we hire who, you know, our friends are, who people that look like us. We all have it. It doesn't matter who you are. We all have biases, but it's getting out of the way and bringing the right people and, you know, to solve some of these challenges that we have. But I feel like going into it knowing that they can be solved, that's kind of the sentiment that we have to have. Because when I do talk to some people who've been in sport for a very long time, it's that this is a burden, it's going to take time to change, but I think we can't keep on looking at it that way. It's possible. We just have to jump in and roll up our sleeves and try to change it. You know, if anything for ourselves, but for the kids and young girls coming up and other diverse people coming up who, you know, are in a situation where the current model is not, you know, bringing them in. It's not making them feel like they belong. So a lot of work to do, but, you know, I'll share another funny story where I was interviewing a male who worked in basketball, and he said they had hired a woman as I think she was an assistant coach, and they had to go to a tournament, and they didn't realize that she got there and she's like, you know, I need my own locker room. So just even stuff like that, it just has to be transformed. We have to start thinking, you know, in larger ways and, you know, access for people, and understanding that obviously she wouldn't be getting dressed in a male's locker room, like she needed her own space. So it's just funny that that wasn't there and it wasn't put in place. But he also said, you know, she brought the issue to them, they were able to solve it. And sometimes it's uncovering things that they just weren't even thinking about. You know, it wasn't that they were doing it on purpose, they just never even thought about that. So
Yeah, but creating the space for her to actually
yes,
voice that and not
yes.
sort of be a thing, right? That it's like, oh yeah, no, we hadn't thought about that. Thank you for sharing. We are sort of at a point in our journey together where we get to do last comments. So I'm gonna open it up to each of you to do a last comment. So I'm not gonna point to someone. Who wants to go first?
I did want to build on what we were just saying, and maybe it's an appropriate last comment. Because the getting out of the way, I've thought about a lot personally, because I think as senior leaders in the sports system, you at least for me, I thought, oh, I have to have the answers. I have to provide the leadership. I have to know. And what has been so reassuring to me, what provides me with hope and with enthusiasm for the future, is all of the young leaders that are coming up, that are, you know, showing the way, that know that are coming with those attitudes already, that, you know, so yes, we're trying to figure it out top down, but coming up to support that is this whole new generation of leaders, and in the parasport world, leaders who understand parasport, who are passionate, who have a better education than I have. You know, just recently on a staff meeting, I said something that, and then two of my staff were like, well, no, this, and this. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, tell me more, help me learn. And feeling like, you know, I can't remember what it was. I think it was on our conference this week, Andrea, was about leadership and fellowship. And so not always feeling like leadership has to be you're out in front doing all the things, but fellowship, recognizing when, no matter who it is, no matter what role they have, what, you know, getting rid of the sort of seniority and that kind of thing. There are some amazing young voices, many of whom that I have the privilege to work with, coming up and leading and not afraid to say what needs to be said. And it's such a privilege to be able to sort of step to the side and say, yeah, this person's like, this is coming. So I think that gives me a lot of hope. And I think, you know, we talked a lot about being at that pivotal moment, that this transformative moment. And for me personally, it was, you know, reflecting on my own leadership and watching Kamala Harris last week and all the clips, and watching her dancing and laughing a full body laugh and wearing running shoes and wearing jeans. And I, you know, for so long I thought, you know, I have to be serious. I have to not be my full self. I have to sort of suppress my joy so that people will take me seriously at the board table as the only woman, as the young person. And I'm loving that we're approaching this time in history now where women in particular, and I think more people in general, can just show up with their whole self. and still be able to be taken seriously and still lead and still have a voice without being diminished by those other things that make them whole.
Beautiful last wrap-up comment. Thank you, Gail. Ainka, over to you for a wrap-up comment.
Yeah, there was an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think that for me, I'm seeing the power of collaboration. I'm seeing the power of all these women that we've featured and diverse people that we've featured becoming an ecosystem. So when I get requests sometimes for past panelists to do other things or maybe get paid jobs, I'm passing their names on. I'm keeping in touch with them to say, you know, so and so needs your voice, and keep your voice out there. I think we can all go faster together. You know, that's just sort of how I feel, and that's how She's for Sports has become. We featured women from the States, women from Canada, as I said, Paralympic athletes. I've had fathers email me, can we bring our daughters to your event? We're creating spaces where families can come. And I just think that we're all stronger together. So that's kind of my last parting words. It's just, I can't wait to see what happens next. And it's all about community and bringing more people that either, you know, as Gail said, have the same interests that you have or different interests, but may know more than me. I'm constantly learning. It's just building myself around those people and bringing them along this fun journey of being an entrepreneur.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much for that last wrap-up comment, and to both of you for being here and showing up and supporting my little piece of how we move forward together. And you know, I do agree there's so many opportunities, but we need to do it together, and we need to learn and to amplify the voices we haven't heard from, and to just create those spaces. So thank you both so much for taking this journey with us today, and to our audience for being here. And I'm just going to share next week's guest, because we have another Bridges of Belonging next week. So we have Stephanie Dixon and Josh Vandervies, who are the Team Canada Paralympic Chef de Mission and Assistant Chef de Mission for Tokyo. And they'll be with us next week on the 17th for Bridges. So hopefully folks can tune in and join us then. And appreciate everyone being here today, and wish you a great day. Stay healthy and well.